Good morning. My name is Mary Hendrickson. I come from across the state line. We're in Columbia, Missouri, at the University of Missouri. And I just want to say that I think it's been spectacular that we've been able to get Becca and Debbie out here to our heartland. And they've done some really incredible work on food systems. And I just want to thank them for the work that they've done. And think what K-State and the University of Missouri could do if we had some food systems extension work like what Becca's doing at Colorado State. That's just a plug if any of the educators or curators or anybody's in the audience here. These kinds of investments are important. So I'm a rural sociologist. I'm going to kind of build on what Becca just covered around economic impacts. I'm going to expand that into looking at community-wide impacts. I've done some work on food systems, and in fact, I spent a lot of time working in Kansas City in the 90s and 2000s on local food systems. I know a lot of you folks here in the audience because of that work. But I've also done some research that looks at the economic impacts of food systems in Nebraska and Missouri. I've been particularly interested in rural food systems too, and I think the rural-urban linkages that Becca mentioned are really important. So a lot of my research on Nebraska and Missouri actually replicated a lot what Becca talked about in terms of economics. So I'm going to talk about some of the other kinds of wealth creation that can come from thinking differently about food systems. So first of all, I just want you to close your eyes for 10 seconds. And I want you to imagine, you think about your community that you come from, and I want you to imagine the thing that you like most about living there. What do you like most about living there? All right. All right. Tell me what you like most about living in your community. It's safe. Okay, safety. Walkability. Neighbors. Beautiful. It's beautiful. So we got beauty, neighbors, safety. Anybody else? What do you like most about living in your community? Yes? Opportunities. What kind of opportunities?
Business, small business.
Great.
All kinds of opportunities.
Okay, so there's economic opportunities there. Anybody else? Responsive government. So the policies. Anything else? Yes?
Something that's kind of unique or distinctive.
Pardon?
Something that is unique or distinctive.
Okay, so you like it because it's like a place that nobody else lives in, right? It's got some distinction there, right? So when you think about that, not one of you except, well, one person mentioned economic opportunities. Now, those underlie all the things you talked about, but not one of you really said, I love living here because of the economics, right? So I want you to think about that because the economics are extremely important, and I'm the first person to say, you've got to think about profitability. You've got to think about those things when you're a farmer, when you're a small business person, when you're thinking about attracting businesses and so on to your town. But those are not always the reasons that people stay there or people love living there. And, my husband loves the little town I came from. I grew up in Shickley, Nebraska, which is 2 hours north of Salina. And what he loves about going back there with me is that everybody still knows me. And I haven't lived there for about, 30 years, 25 years. Everybody still knows me. And I can recognize all their kids because they look like the kids I went to school with, right? But that's one thing he loves. He grew up outside of Flint, Michigan, and it wasn't the same thing, okay? So these are things, I want you to think about those as I go through some of these other kinds of community wealth generation that we can think about with community food systems and local food systems. But as Becca said, it can be lots of different ways of organizing that food system. So one thing I want to just reiterate is that when we think about local food systems or regional food systems or community food systems, whatever kind of thing you want to call it, we're really thinking about the entire system. So it's not just farmers, it's the food hubs, it's the processors, it's the distribution, it's grocery stores or food cooperatives, it's how are we managing waste? It's the entire system, right? And that system is made up of networks. And it's made up of lots of partnerships and lots of people going together, doing things, having fun. I think food systems, we need to remember that lots of it's about having fun, about enjoying what you're doing, either shopping, eating, producing. It's about knowledge. It's about innovation. I love going to farming conferences where people are really oriented to community food production because they're all talking about the newest idea that they've employed on the farm. In fact, if you've ever been to the 4-state or 5-state vegetable growers conference up in St. Joseph, Missouri, they have a farmer night, farmer innovation night, where everybody claps for the thing they like the most, right? And somebody wins a little prize, but there's like really cool things that happen. And then it's a lot about the relationships. And those relationships, in fact, these networks don't work without those relationships. So when we think about, there's a nice little thing I can see on there. When we think about community food systems and some of the impacts, then one of the things we found out in Missouri and Nebraska is, why do farmers participate in these local food systems? And there's a couple of things about income on there, but it's about pride and satisfaction in supporting other local producers, independence, autonomy. These kinds of things are why people like to orient themselves to local food systems. Because what we're doing is we're building a lot of different kinds of capitals. There's a couple of rural sociologists out of Iowa, Cornelia and Jan Flora, that talk a lot about community capitals. This has been picked up and in the rural social sciences. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more here. But they said, look, capital, that's anything that we can kind of reinvest and grow more of, right? So there's financial capital, right? We're focused on financial capital. It's privileged in our society. It's what we think about. It's what makes our economies run. But there's also other capitals that help us build financial capital, and that also are the things like safety and opportunity and neighbors, all those things you mentioned that you loved about living in your local community. So things like social capital, human capital, which Becca mentioned, cultural capital, built capital, the natural capital. And I mentioned this last night. We were driving from Geringer's produce farm up to the winery, and it was a pretty drive, right? It's kind of a nice landscape. I'm a plains person. I came from north of Salina, so I like those wide open spaces. But still, it was really pretty. See trees and stuff like that, and rolling hills over there. So that landscape is an amenity, and we need to think about it that way as well. So the natural capital is important. Now, I'm going to go through kind of pretty quickly, but we might dive into this a little bit more in the afternoon session too, thinking about how we grow those capitals. And another term for this is comprehensive wealth creation or rural wealth creation. And there's a great little workbook on this from can't remember what. Thank you. National Association of Development Organizations. And they've got a guide they put out in November 2016, which some of this will come from. And they talk about community wealth rooted in place. Now that's important. And Becca talked about this a little bit, but it's rooted in place through local ownership and control. Now, some of you might know that I also study global food systems, and I talk a lot about concentration and consolidation of the food system. That's not local control, and that's not local wealth, okay? So we're thinking about maybe things in the food system where we can have local ownership and control, self-reliance, and resilience. And I'm going to talk about resilience at the very end. Internationally, we talk a lot about livelihoods. And that's something we can apply here. And livelihoods are the capabilities, the assets, material and social resources that are required for a means of living. So we're thinking about what kinds of livelihoods we're creating in our communities. And what are the social, natural, political, built capital things that these livelihoods are accessing and growing. And as Becca mentioned, it's about net, right? Because you can grow capital, you can lose capital. There's trade-offs. And so it's about the net. And we want to make sure that we have a positive net, but we have trade-offs, as Becca mentioned. So we have to think about measuring both what creates and what takes away from these different kinds of capital. And frankly, it's a lot easier to measure financial capital because there's a dollar sign, and that's the easy one to measure. It's harder to measure some of these other things. We've been trying. So I want to talk a little bit about those indicators. So human capital. What are we doing to increase the leadership skills of the people in our communities? What are, farmers markets, these direct marketing opportunities doing to increase the knowledge and skills of farmers, but also knowledge and skills of consumers, knowledge and skills of processors, and so on. So that's really important because there's a lot of hiccups as we reorganize food systems to be more locally controlled, local ownership. There's some hiccups. It takes a lot of innovation. So what are we thinking about in terms of developing that human capital? And those are some indicators that come from that report on measuring, on comprehensive wealth creation. But improving health in a local population. You got to have healthy people, right, for your communities to operate well. Increase the number of partnerships that we're doing. How can we do this? Well, we need to provide some technical assistance. We need to bring people together, provide educational opportunities, mentoring, networking. So last night, Frank Geringer was talking about this new apple orchard that he is establishing, and it's much more intensive. And he's been sharing work with another person. There's only 3 or 4 in the state of Kansas that are doing this, but that's new, innovative, and there needs to be some technical assistance that's available for that. Those kinds of investments are also important, those things in helping people develop themselves. Social capital. Now this is always near and dear to a sociologist's heart, right? But social capital, what do we mean? Well, communities that have high social capital are able to get things done, okay? It's the existing stock of trust, relationships, networks. It's the interactions among groups. People have a collective identity. They have a shared sense, or a sense of a shared future. And I will brag on my little hometown here, but it has a community foundation that is organized under the Nebraska Community Foundation. And it has raised a ton of money from people in the community, but that's not what makes it great. It has evaluated needs in my home community and outside of the food system. It decided that childcare was a big issue in rural areas. And so it's developed with the school I think it's from 6 months and up, you can place your kids in childcare right next to the school. And that's allowed people, that's attracted a lot of young families to my hometown. Now, what's the social capital aspect of that? Well, people networked together. They had some money from the community foundation to help it work, but it was the partnerships, it's the trust, it's the idea, oh, we want this for our community. We want to invest in the future of our community. Those things are really important. Community leadership programs can be really valuable in helping people map the assets that are there in the community. Food policy councils are a way of helping people create the partnerships and the networks necessary to build this social capital and to use social capital to achieve other gains. So this is from the Kansas City Star in 2015. Small farms band together to grow their connections. That's a way of increasing trust and thinking about the sense of a shared future. Your Douglas County Food Policy Council has shamelessly stole that off your website. But there's people gathered together, and there's a space for interaction and a space for different groups to get together. And I think that's one of the more important things about food policy councils. It's that people that don't always talk to each other come together and say, oh, we have some similar interests here. We have some different ways of addressing things. So those are ways of building and utilizing social capital. Natural capital. I remarked on the natural beauty last night here. Water quality. Water quality, I know Kansas, Nebraska, these are big issues about water quality and quantity, right? But soil health is becoming a hugely important thing for farmers as well. Diversity of animals and plants is a societal issue that we're thinking about globally. So these are, how are we increasing the existing stock of natural resources? And sometimes I'm not positive on the plains that we've done a great job of taking care of our natural resources and building them. So let's think about, increasing the number of acres or sites residents and visitors can enjoy natural amenities. That keeps people in their place. Improve water quality, which is really important in rural areas where sometimes we get stuff from well waters or surface water. So we need to think about how can we help encourage farmers and others to diversify operations, because a diverse landscape generally tends to be one that we enjoy being in, right? Now that can be that wide open spaces I love on the plains. It can be more the rolling hills that are in Missouri. It doesn't matter. It matters if there's a diversity. You hear birds, you can see animals and different things like that. So we have to think about how can we provide some ongoing technical assistance in sustainable soil and water management strategies, for instance. Whoops, did I just end it? Oh, no, I'm sorry, I got a couple more things to talk about. So, this is a picture of a Flint Hills ranch that attracts visitors out there, but also has their cattle ranch. And, that's a pretty space. People want to be there. Farmers are over by Lexington, Missouri, which is just east of Kansas City, driving out there on Highway 24. It's a beautiful drive. There's a lot of orchards. There's a lot of wineries along there. It's becoming very diversified. Now, I grew up on a corn and soybean farm. We like corn and soybeans. My husband always says, wow, Nebraska is so green in the summertime. He doesn't think about it being so green. But we used to have wheat, we used to have hay, we used to have a lot of different things that kind of broke those fields up, and it was really, in a lot of ways, prettier when I was growing up, a place that we wanted to be. Political capital. So kind of the existing stock of goodwill, influence, and power that people have and can exercise in decision making. And this is important. And I think food systems are really important for increasing civic engagement. And so we can talk about decision making being broadly shared, how people are interacting in participating in those decision making, and so on. And Michael Carolyn is a rural sociologist from Colorado State, and he has a nice paper out about more than active food citizens, about people participating in farmers markets, CSAs, and food cooperative, and talking about how they were focused on food, and they kind of got into food, and Debbie mentioned this in her presentation. They kind of get into food, but then they get into other stuff, and they become more engaged in the issues, the kind of the political issues. And political, I don't mean, that's not a dirty word to me. It's the way people solve complex issues, right? And so they get engaged and they do things and think about things differently because there's some proximity that's created. People are interacting in different ways. Built capital is really important as well. And, you know, I think a big issue in rural areas is broadband access, right? That's something that is part of built capital, and it's going to be really important for helping some of our community food system work go on. But it's, you know, buildings, it's aggregation and distribution, it's those food hubs that Becca was talking about, road improvement, these kinds of things. These can come through private-public partnerships, and I want to just mention that this is in Columbia, Missouri, and I think it's a really interesting thing. We've been trying to work on developing a covered farmers market for a long time, but this is now the Columbia Parks and Recreation are going to be part of this. It's a demonstration farm, it's food literacy, it's all kinds of things. And you know who the lead and gift came from? The hospital. The hospital put the lead gift into this because they're interested in healthy people. But you know, it's not just the fruits and vegetables you get like at a farmer's market. It's the relationships. It's the reduction in isolation. It's the ability to see and talk to people. Those are all very important for health as well, and we know that. So the last thing I want to talk about is about resilience. And this has become kind of near and dear to my heart, and a colleague from North Carolina actually provided the examples I'm going to use. But as we think about the kinds of commodity chains, global commodity chains that a lot of our farmers have to participate in and that we get a lot of our food from, who gets to make the decisions in those, and how reactive can they be to place? Now, these are important things for resilience because it's the capacity of the system to absorb shocks and kind of bounce back, okay? Longer, specialized, centralized, and consolidated supply chains are very vulnerable to disruption. And those can come from tornadoes, which are relatively easier to recover from, frankly, but hurricanes, floods, pandemics. You know, what goes when you have a pandemic? We haven't had one for a long time, but transportation starts to go. And then global trade. We are right in the midst of disruptions right now, right, in global trade that are really important to our farmers in Kansas and Missouri and Nebraska, all these things, right? So as we think about what that doesn't mean that that's good or bad, it just means it's a disruption. People made investments thinking that this trade was going to go on, and now, you know, there might be disruptions in it. So thinking about how can we recover from things, this is from my colleague Scott Marlowe in North Carolina, and they're specifically looking at who's been able to recover most quickly after the Hurricane Matthew in 2016. And he said this Simply Natural Creamery, their cows are out on grass, so they didn't have a feed issue per se, right? They were able to get back into, they were the first bottled milk that was back on the grocery store shelves after Hurricane Matthew. Because they were there, they were locally owned, they had a very resilient farm set up, they had on-farm processing capacity, and it's really important. And by the way, policies, USDA policies, the Value-Added Producer Grant Program helped them develop that on-farm processing capacity. Crescent City Farmers Market in New Orleans was opened before grocery stores were after Hurricane Katrina. So these things are important in terms of thinking about resilience. And so I'm going to stop there. We have a few minutes for questions. Is that right, Helen? But I just think it's really important to think about all of the kinds of wealth that can be created. I have a graduate student working in the Ozarks on rural food systems, and one of the quotes that she keeps coming back to is, health is wealth. This is why people do like this foraging and so on. Health is wealth. So that's one way of summing up that there's a lot of ways of thinking about capital and wealth, and we need to think about what food systems can do as we invest in food systems, what other kinds of capitals they create. So, thank you very much.